The following is a conversation. It has the features of any conversation, such as imperfectly expressed thoughts, ill-considered opinions, and the notions of several sleep-deprived brains. Try not to get your stethoscope in a twist about it.
I went and bought this 5-hour energy. I had a choice between regular strength and extra strength, and I bought the regular strength one because, I've never tried one of these before. And I'm not going to.
Take it right now.
How many milligrams of caffeine does it have? Is that what it is?
It's
caffeine,
200
right?
milligrams of caffeine.
That's a hefty dose. I feel like when the people say you can have 3 cups of coffee a day, they're talking a cup equals 100 milligrams of caffeine.
Which is
do we need to fact check this?
Please do.
All right, fine. I'll look it up.
The thing is, I've probably already had 2 16-ounce coffees today.
So you have some tolerance.
Or 4 16-ounce coffees today.
So this is the problem. When we're saying a cup of coffee, 8 fluid ounces contains 95 milligrams of coffee. That means most people, like myself, are not just having 8 ounces of coffee or 8 fluid ounces of coffee.
So they have coffee enemas. Can we do a 5-hour?
Do
enema?
not. PSA for everybody out there: do not put coffee in your anus. The coffee guy.
But we're not. Jury's out on the 5-hour energies. Maybe that's better.
We, are you proposing this for the show? I don't know.
Is this going to be like a second act for one?
Well, I just said we have them. They exist. This is not medical advice for you or listeners.
Today on Act 2 of the Short Code Podcast, we're all giving each other coffee enemas.
I have one more thought on the caffeine of the 5-hour energy, though. Yeah. My take on caffeine in doses that are other than like coffee or tea is that's when you maybe have a caffeine problem. Yeah. This is my take. Yeah. Caffeine pills or caffeine in a 5-hour energy, you just want it right in your system.
Right.
Versus the coffee, this is me justifying my coffee addiction. Because of the addiction that I now have, I can convince myself that it's because of the taste of this bitter bean water.
Just straight black coffee tastes delicious.
When I moved to Iowa, pour over coffee was not a thing where I came from in Massachusetts.
I'm such a psycho that I make pour over every single morning.
Okay, that's dumb. But
don't disrespect my addiction. It means that I only drink 1 cup a day. But
I remember going to the coffee shop and being like, I'll have a coffee. And they were like, sure. And then they began to pour it over this funnel thing. And I'm like, what the are you doing? I'm a busy man. Is this what Iowa is? You have nothing to do and you can just stand in front of a thing. Give me the sweet, already brewed coffee so I can run and gun.
So I'm going to go ahead and say that. So I don't drink really caffeine ever. I don't really take it unless I'm doing a long, a night shift or something. At that point, I would rather do something like the 5-hour energy or a pill because I'm not here for the taste. I just need this one energy for this one evening and then we're done. The relationship's over.
That is the healthiest form of caffeine pills or 5-hour energies because you don't have caffeine constantly. It's the people that are having 4 cups of coffee a day and then they're like, and I need an extra dose.
Yeah. But also
you can visibly see their pulse from across the room. That's probably concern.
This is not medical advice, by the way. This is simply aRiley opinion.
It's about the rate too, though. It's about the rate of ingestion too. You take whatever a Starbucks, it's 200
this is
milligrams.
Shots versus 40-ounce beer.
Correct. An Edward 40. Yeah, correct.
40
Double fisting. You're going to drink it slower. Casey Musgraves. You're going to have that slow burn. You're going to have that nice bolus.
I guess I don't know what the bioavailability of caffeine is, so.
I could imagine it's probably faster if you down it in one enema versus 4 hours of sipping.
I think what you mean is you up it in one
there is
enema.
no downing in enemas. It is going up.
Okay, yep. My anatomical anterior, posterior, superior.
I don't know. I feel like when you take it 5-hour energy, it's just so soulless. When you're drinking a beverage, it's an experience. If you do the 5-hour energy, you're just taking a drug, man.
I guarantee there's not a single person on that point that has their 5-hour energy and is like, I'm going to cherish this morning. This is going to make my day.
Meandering in the margins of medicine, it's the Short Code Podcast.
Weird news,
fresh views,
helpful clues, and interviews.
By students, for students.
Subscribe to our weekly show at theshortcode.com.
Welcome back to the Short Code Podcast, the show that gives you an inside look at medical school from the students drinking from that fire hose. It's a production of the University of Iowa Carver College of Medicine. Just going to let that burn into your brain for a second.
Drinking from that fire hose, should we say drinking from that pour over?
Drinking from that 5-hour energy. With me today in the SCP studio, 2 halves of his body are mirror images of each other along a central axis It's M1 Jeff Goddard.
That's more or less accurate, yes.
As a member of the phylum Chordata and the subphylum Vertebrata, he's characterized by having a backbone made of vertebrae. It's M4 Nathan Spitz.
Was that a compliment?
Yeah.
Thank you.
His endoskeleton provides plenty of support and protection for his body. It's M4 Mitch Lefebvre.
What up, y'all?
And she has a coelom lined by mesodermal tissue housing her internal organs. It's MD PhD student Riley B. Bush.
I do, yeah.
You missed the opportunity to say those that are receiving the enema that is that fire hose.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Pucker up, everybody.
You set it up and everything.
No, actually, don't pucker. Relax.
Yeah. It's going to go a lot better for you if you relax.
It's a rite of passage of medical school. What can we say?
You're going to feel some pressure. Breathe.
Did you really quick?
Did you start doing coffee enemas in 1 year?
No, yes. I was going to say, did you start your caffeine? Did your caffeine addiction really go into high gear during medical school, or had you already?
Yes, medical school.
Yeah, okay.
That's where it comes from.
Fair.
Mine was undergrad.
Okay.
Because I felt like I needed the caffeine more. It started to become a thing that tasted good because usually you start with
Definitely
the sugary
an acquired
beverages.
Taste, yeah.
Yeah, I grew up thinking it smelled terrible because my parents are both coffee drinkers. Yeah. And then you start in college, you get the sugary lattes, and then you realize those are expensive and you're poor, so you just go to the black coffee, and then now I love it. So
the 2022 Merriam-Webster dictionary word of the year was goblin mode.
Was it actually?
It was goblin. I don't remember if it was Merriam or Oxford. Anyway, one of the dictionaries, it was goblin mode. And I would say my caffeine addiction really ramped up in undergrad. Being a resident assistant, we had the meal swipes or things like that you could use at the library, or flex meals, and you could get a drink, an entree, and 2 sides. And at 10:50 p.m., 10 minutes before the library cafeteria closed, I would go and get a 20-ounce Starbucks coffee to feel. This was real goblin mode.
Wow.
Not
real,
recommended.
No, 0 out of 10. I was disrespecting my body in undergrad. It was really unhealthy. Looking back, I'm surprised that I made it out alive.
Again, I don't consume caffeine.
We all
have different relationships.
Have you dabbled in caffeine consumption?
Yeah, I mean, like I've said, if I work overnight shifts or that stuff, I'll take maybe a caffeine pill if I'm really struggling. But
probably works a lot better that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's more effective. But like for example, last night I got 90 minutes of sleep, which is not healthy. So disrespecting my body.
Goblin mode. That's some goblin mode right there.
I didn't die. I just don't feel like some of my classmates get 8 hours of sleep and they are so sluggish until they get their coffee. And personally, I just don't want that experience in life. I don't want the first
something that I can relate to.
Yeah, I don't want the first hour and 15 minutes of my day to be terrible until I get to coffee. I like to wake up and just exist and be happy.
Well, I have a fun coffee fact is that you're actually not supposed to drink coffee for the first 90 minutes of the day.
Okay, Andrew Huberman.
I was going to say, shout out Andy Huberman. I don't think I can call him Andy. Because if we're going to get science-y here, adenosine is the thing in your brain that binds to your receptors that kind of tells you're still sleepy. And so you need the 90 minutes in the day to let the adenosine actually bind and then metabolize away before you have coffee. If you have coffee before that, it blocks the adenosine, but the adenosine stays and floats around so that when the caffeine then unbinds, the adenosine is right there and can just bind. So that's why you get the crash after you drink coffee in the afternoon.
So would this explain why on the weekends, this only happens on the weekends because this is when I have time for this sort of nonsense. So I get up in the morning, I throw back 16 ounces of cold brew, and then not long after that, I take a nap.
I mean, that's right after the cold brew?
Not right after, but
probably
within a period of 2 hours or something.
But I think you've got the environment right there. You have the ability to take a nap, right?
I'm also traditionally still in the bed.
Correct, right? If you brought a bed into work and silenced all of your equipment, locked your doors, could you drink cold brew and still take a nap?
That sounds like a fantastic plan, actually. I'm going to
try. This is for science.
I'm going to try, right.
For science.
For science.
So,
Dean Cooper, I hope you don't mind.
Please don't knock them running an experiment.
This is science.
It's for science.
Going on here. Jeff, I don't know what we're talking about today.
Apparently,
do you?
Yeah, I brought some things to talk about. They may be controversial. Let's find out.
Okay.
So, as you may or may not know, I am a bit of a nerd. And my Google alerts tell me...
My antenna has been twanging.
Yeah.
A goblin mode type of nerd.
Exactly. Some people have their Google alert set to Dave Bautista or whatever. Mine are set to the Cochrane Review, or stuff like that. So that was a sly reference to the Glass Onion. Go watch a good movie, guys.
He's done with those type of roles.
Is he? What is he gonna do?
He's refining himself.
He has to go find
himself.
the
arts now.
Yeah. So the thing that I want to talk about today was the concept of equipoise, and in the context of a couple of studies that have come out recently. So I'm gonna
raise your hand if you don't know what equipoise is.
I only know because I asked him before we started.
Please use it in a sentence. What's the origin?
When I read this, because all I had about this topic was molnupiravir, equipoise, and research. And of course, I immediately assumed that equipoise was a penis drug.
Okay, yeah, it is not indeed a penis drug. Equipoise is this idea that there is reasonable dissension on an idea. Right?
Oh, okay.
That there are reasonable
people
parties,
can disagree.
Yeah, reasonable people could disagree on this, right? So, for example, we might say...
a concept that we're thoroughly unfamiliar with in
today's
2023. But go ahead.
But I think that in medicine, I think most of us would be reasonably comfortable saying there is not equipoise on the issue of vaccines and autism, right? We've studied that to death over the last 25 years. We're comfortable saying there's no more equipoise. We don't have to study that. But some other issues that may be politically charged shouldn't be scientifically charged, and there still is some equipoise, right? We're still trying to figure this out. Recently, the head of the CDC was in front of Congress testifying, and they asked why certain things hadn't been studied during the COVID pandemic. And she said, well, there wasn't equipoise. And that's the question. Who gets to decide what's reasonable dissent?
So in this testimony, what they were saying is, again, the definition of equipoise, I have to keep reminding myself of that because it's a new word. It is, they weren't studying it because we felt like we already knew the answer to those questions.
Whether or not somebody thought that they knew the answer to those questions, they didn't feel like there were reasonable people arguing in good faith on the other side.
Okay.
Right?
Was this about COVID research specifically?
COVID research
or other
specifically,
kinds?
right?
Okay.
Because in this country it became, unfortunately and tragically, politicized, right?
Yeah.
In the premise that we don't need to do a randomized control trial that parachutes work when jumping out of a plane.
Yeah.
If to use an extreme example.
Except that we, in medicine, use that metaphor all the time, and every time we do, we end up studying it, and turns out it wasn't actually a parachute, right? So that's the concern.
They used to give, estrogen replacement therapy to postmenopausal women, and it actually was increasing morbidity and mortality. So, but it was like, well... you replace the estrogen, it's good, right? Because they used to have it.
Yeah.
But it ended up being bad.
Oh, but that study though, I can't
I was gonna say there's something that's
they studied
since changed back on
the
that.
target population in that they only studied older women, so they didn't have the longitudinal data to track long term. I don't remember the exact specifics, but at least in that study, there's been several outcries or backlashes against that study due to its limited patient population, the limited scope, their lack of ability to track long-term changes and things like that. But
we might use the word in this juncture equipoise. There is equipoise around that research.
Is equipoise different than a lack of knowledge that we?
I think it's a communal recognition of that lack of knowledge is the point. This idea that there are people that have different ideas of what might be the answer because we don't have enough answer to say what is the answer.
I feel like it's lack of knowledge plus the desire to get that knowledge. I don't think that you could have equipoise around hey, we don't know. I don't know what we don't know that we also wouldn't care to know. Something that we wouldn't care to know also.
I think that's also fair, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So an example that came out this year that I thought was a really good study was the molnupiravir study in the UK. So that's, for those that don't know, that's essentially their prophylaxis similar to Paxlovid here in the United States, right? And it worked phenomenally in unvaccinated patients to significantly decrease mortality with COVID and infectivity. So they're sicker for less period of time and it's less severe. They did a study trying to see what the effects would be on vaccinated people, because now the majority of people are vaccinated. We want to see how this would go. What would you assume the results of that would be?
That it would be less effective or less dramatic of effect if people are already vaccinated.
It's a reasonable assumption, right? You might think maybe there's an additive effect, maybe there's a synergistic effect, or maybe there's no increased effect. There is equipoise. And so they studied it, and it showed, just like you said, there wasn't a statistically significant benefit to taking this prophylaxis if you are already vaccinated. That is already giving you the immunological advantage that you need in this case, right?
Is this a fair study though, assuming that times have changed and the virus itself changed, right? Earlier we were working with, I don't even remember some of the earlier variants, Delta
B7.
that were like a lot more lethal, less infective, and then the shift towards Omicron and a less lethal, more infective.
Yeah. So, I mean, this was published at the very end of last year, so they're likely studying things, over the course of the pandemic, not the entire pandemic, of course. This is a relatively new therapy to begin with, right? Gotcha. So that's a good point. This is kind of the whole point of this conversation, is that we have to have enough humility to say that there are a lot of things, there are a lot of factors here that we can't really control for, that we're doing our best to try to understand this. I think that the reason why a study like this is really important is because we live in a country where things cost a lot of money. Paxlovid is not necessarily a cheap intervention, especially if you don't have insurance. It would be reasonable to say, is this going to provide a benefit to me if I'm going to be shelling out $10,000 for it? I think, right? But we have to agree that there's equipoise on that conversation first. How do we do that?
Like, who's deciding if there's equipoise or not?
Well, I mean, I guess it's kind of a communal consensus, right?
Yeah.
So,
Well, I think who decides what research gets performed is who gets funded. Who does the NIH fund or other like institutions, and the grant reviewers, like, because you can only fund so many grants, right? Like a clinical trial can't get done without money. So who thinks it's important? And I think that could be, it could be for the duty of science, or like holding to that ideal of understanding more and helping people. But it could also be like financial, like drug companies wanting to look at certain things because they think they can make money off of it. So I don't think anyone, like one person, decides it. It's more of maybe like a system that's deciding what's getting done.
Yeah. And I would say that, like, I for sure unequivocally disagree with people like, I'm going to have to name drop, Rand Paul, for example, on this idea that there is a lot of government waste around basic science research. I understand the concern that you can't see the applicability of this specific knowledge, but that's all of science. You need to do basic science in order to get to a point where you can understand how this might be applicable to applied science, right? I guess my concern is, for example, here in the United States, because it became such a political issue, there were a lot of things throughout the pandemic that weren't studied because they couldn't get funding for it, right? There were no NIH grants toward a lot of issues around COVID, which was tragic, honestly, because there are a lot of answers that we could have had that we didn't get. Now, I want to back up and say there are a lot of things that we did study that I'm like, it's phenomenal that we did, right? The Project Warp Speed, as much as there's been some controversy around it, it was a phenomenal research endeavor, a partner between private and public funding. I loved it, right? It's about certain treatments early on in the pandemic. Are these going to be effective? I mean, I remember, wow, there's this cool study that says that this is basically going to be the miracle cure. And then we did a quick study on it and found out that wasn't the case, right? And we pushed those research.
Ivermectin. Sorry.
Ivermectin is literally on my list, right? Hydroxychloroquine, things that people said, hey, this is the cure. And so everybody said, all right, let's study it. And they did like 40 studies. They knocked them out, boom, because they wanted to show, because there was equipoise. And then now there isn't, right? Because we were able to study it and put the issue to rest, right?
I think what's frustrating partially in the kind of idea of equipoise, and as we're naming examples, a lot of them are, does it cure COVID? Does it not cure COVID? Oftentimes, though, kind of as you're alluding to, Mitchell, like the basic science isn't as shiny, and like the NIH actually needs to fund basic science work to kind of build a foundation that we can then build everything else on. But I think what the problem with basic science is, and why it's not shiny to the US population, is that scientists aren't that great at explaining why basic science research is necessary. To tell someone, hey, I discovered XYZ protein, it does XYZ signaling to turns on XYZ DNA. I mean, if you hear,
not a very compelling story.
It's not a very compelling. It's an
then you
awesome
see the sticker
science
shock.
story. But you're like, what's the protein? The name's like a bunch of letters and numbers put together, and maybe it like is monoclonal, so it's got MAB at the end. Whatever it may be. That isn't as exciting for people, and I think about this a lot. In that scientists are partially to blame for this because we are not seeing our jobs as the salespeople that we actually need to be, as far as getting people to understand and value our research. So I think when we talk about equipoise, there's so much around like finding cures for things, whereas a lot of times to find the cure, it is these like basic science research. And like you said, there's a lot of people that are like, boo basic science research, get rid of it, it's not useful.
Oh yeah, I mean, I've heard like clinicians allude to like, I don't care about basic science research, just show me like the translational benefit, or like it, because if it doesn't help a patient, it doesn't matter. But the way, I don't know how you explain it to people, either whether it's other, healthcare professionals or scientists or the general public. But I would say we don't understand fundamentally how many things in the world work. And when we learn more about how the world works, we end up discovering things that have unpredictable benefits, like CRISPR technology for gene editing, which is, still being developed, but it has a lot of promise for human treatment. That was discovered, I think, originally in E. coli, and people were doing like basic science research, but it probably wasn't funded by the National Institutes of Health first. It's probably like an NSF grant or something. The same thing is true for like checkpoint blockade therapy, which has revolutionized cancer therapy. A lot of that work was fleshed out in a mouse model where they were studying chronic lymphocytic choriomeningitis virus infection in mice, which is not really a super clinically translatable infection model, although there's a lot of great science that's done with that in terms of immunology. And again, when it was first discovered, it was just this like PD-1, like, oh, the T cells are being less functional, and if we reverse this, now they're more functional in this mouse model. It's just like CRISPR. We didn't even know what it was when we found it. You couldn't go out and be like, oh, I'm going to figure out how to like reverse immune dysfunction in cancer, because we didn't even fundamentally understand that was a big issue necessarily in cancer. So we don't know what we don't know. And so to fill those gaps, a lot of what we do, we just have to say, this is worth knowing because it might tell us something about how the world works, but we can't even predict what that is right now.
I mean, I personally like the idea of living in a society, and I know that this is very idealistic of me, but that seeks knowledge for the sake of knowledge, right? And to be proud of that fact that we fund knowledge for the sake of knowledge. But it kind of to your point that, like, imagine, like, we have such hindsight bias looking at research that's been done. Like, all of the basic science research that didn't come to fruition, we can look at the examples that did. Like, for example, some guy was playing in his spare room and he was trying to figure out what the heck electrons were up to, and all of a sudden we have x-rays. Like, one of the most important, to this day, one of the most important diagnostic tools that we have in medicine, right? Including one of the most important, like, tools we have to treat certain ailments. It was just some guy playing in his room. He just like, electrons are cool, right? He had no idea that was going to happen. Who was funding that guy, right? Who was the modern day equivalent of some guy dinking around in his room in a scientific way that might create that? There's no way to know.
Shortcoats, we love to hear from you, no matter what it's about. So call us at 347-SHORT-CT with questions, shower thoughts, complaints about your situation, whatever you like. We'll talk about it on the show.
This is also sort of what's behind the mythos of the lone inventor, you know, as you say, playing around with something. It is. I feel like, is it true that we've discovered a lot of the things that, you know, we could have found by, you know, I always say pouring vomit into our cuts, as we might have done in the 1840s or whatever to try.
I have literally no idea what you're trying to say with pouring vomit into our cuts, but I'll roll with it.
I mean, back in the
They
old,
lost us.
back in
I think
the
it was
old
more
days
like
of
leeches.
Yeah, back in the old
Yeah.
days of medicine, if you wanted to, you know, like if you were like, if you wanted to figure something out, you experimented on yourself.
Oh, fair.
Right?
Yeah.
You know, and you did weird things, like you drank pee to figure out if, you know, somebody was diabetic or...
Still the grossest thing we've ever done.
I think we've not done that, but, you know.
Maybe an answer to that.
Oh, I thought you meant on the podcast.
Oh, not here.
That's not...
In human history, definitely not in this room.
Maybe an answer as to why we don't, to give like a case example, would be that scientist, I believe in China, who was using like CRISPR technologies on babies to like edit out their resistance or to like create resistance to HIV. Like a reason that the scientific community like discourages that self-discovery or like unregulated experiments is like the potential harm now that could come with the technology that we do have.
But what's
today.
interesting about that example, I think, is that if I remember correctly, to get back to Equipoise, the person that you speak of was supported and encouraged by a group of people who felt like it was important, or at least not unimportant, to learn stuff about, you know, through this person's research. And then when it kind of blew up, all of a sudden people were like, no, we
have no idea what he was doing this whole time.
That's crazy.
We definitely don't have email trails going years back. And tacit approval.
So to rope in Equipoise, I think that like brings in the kind of like vocal minority and like how much weight do we give to these people. For example, like in Arkansas, like the lieutenant governor was like citing, like non-practicing physicians and like their opinions or their thoughts on gender affirming care for kids, and like disregarding the evidence from like quite literally almost like every major medical organization. And do we call that Equipoise, that like one or two very vocal fringe non-licensed people? I'm not sure the example of like the Chinese doctor or researcher who did that, but like, is that Equipoise, that we like, yep, there's like one or two people who disagree, so we have to like give this credit, or we have to give credence to this argument? Like, there are things I think, and maybe this is me being like biased and opinionated, that are just like right and wrong, or there's like data proven already like that this is right and this is wrong. Slavery, there are just like things in society that we accept that like this is right, this is wrong. There will like always be Holocaust deniers or things like that, but does that mean because there's Equipoise that we should like study this more? Like,
is that Equipoise? Or
I feel like I have a few more nuanced examples to add to that, where things that we could think of as right or wrong. So there are still things kind of in science that we maybe have done stuff with. So for example, I do some environmental toxin work, and the specific environmental toxin that I look at was actually banned by the US government in the 1970s. You could look at that and say, good job, we did it. Like, we banned it. It's gone.
Is this DDE?
It's not DDE. It's PCBs, if anyone cares, but I won't get into
Right. Yep.
So here, in 2023, y'all have heard of it. I don't think it's because you heard of it being banned in the 1970s. You've heard of it because it sticks around. So the US government's saying, oh, well, we did our things. We remedied it. It's somewhere. But scientists are saying, no, it's in everything we're around. It's in the paint. It's in the caulk.
It's in our blood.
It's in our water. It's in our blood. Like, we have to study this. And now I have to go and convince people that it's worth studying. We could also say the same thing about, gosh, I heard this recently where we're talking about pregnancy. Why do people go into labor? We have kind of an idea. We have a general idea based on hormones. We know that labor is generally a good thing. We're gonna have a baby after that, but why? And like, is it important to study? There are these kind of big overall things like acupuncture, where it's like, we know it kind of works anecdotally. We have thousands of years of evidence based on these, I want to call them Eastern medicine, but I'll call them more alternative medicine therapies. We know they work, but like, why do they work? Are those things worth studying? Is it worth studying environmental toxins that, for all intents and purposes, the US has banned? Is it worth studying why does labor happen? Is it worth studying why does acupuncture work? I'd argue it's worth studying all of those things, but I think there's a lot of equipoise around whether or not the money, time, and energy should actually go to those things.
And I think that's it. It's, there's only so much of anything, time, money, energy, that you can pour into research, the overarching research bucket. And so choices are made. And it seems to me that the funding bodies, whether it's the, NIH or the NFS or whatever you're talking about, they're making those decisions on what is reasonable, right?
I think a lot of it, yeah.
Without the constraints of the government, like, for example, the CDC wasn't allowed under some certain certain presidential bodies to study like gun violence, for example, right? Like, maybe there was Equipoise, or I think it's now like, is that even Equipoise? Like, it's the leading killer of like kids now.
I think it would be important to point out that for fairness sake, that was Congress had passed a law specifically, so that was less of an administration, more of a legislative decision.
There we go. Thank you for.
I also disagree with that legislative decision,
right.
But it was not one presidential administration that made that call.
Well, I would say, and that's an example of like anti-equipoise, because you're not, that's unipolar. Only one side.
You're not debating anything.
Is getting to decide. Yeah.
Our episode today is sponsored by Panacea Financial. It's a nationwide digital bank built for doctors by doctors. Panacea Financial is designed for medical students and residents, as it was founded by two doctors that were financially frustrated during their training. Thousands of doctors have used their PRN personal loan to avoid credit cards and use a better way to cover expenses for residency, relocation, or other life expenses. Panacea's PRN personal loan does not require a cosigner, has no minimum credit score requirement, and has interest rates starting at half of a typical credit card. They also offer a period of no or reduced payments on their PRN personal loan. So go to panaceafinancial.com/matchday to learn more about Panacea and get other helpful information on match day, residency transition, and enter their $500 giveaway to those starting residency this year. Panacea Financial is a division of Primis, member FDIC. Thanks for the support, Panacea. Let's get back to the podcast.
So to throw a kink in this conversation, wrinkling up the paper a bit. On the one hand, I have a heavy bias toward evidence-based medicine and consensus-based practice. On the other, I know this is sampling bias, but like every significant advance has come from an individual and often against the grain of the establishment, right? Like I can't remember his name, but the guy that discovered H. pylori is essentially what's causing ulcers and stomach cancer had to perform it on himself because he couldn't convince anybody else.
Call back, Dave. There we go. Instead of pouring vomit on cuts, it's ingesting bacteria.
I bet someone has poured vomit on their cut in the past. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. And that was like in the last, he won a Nobel Prize in my lifetime because he had to do this experiment by himself because nobody would give him the time of day. And it ended up being revolutionary for cancer prevention, right? It's saving us in the United States, hundreds of thousands of dollars per cancer patient, right? So how do we balance? We want evidence-based, we want consensus science, and also, it's going to be that one weirdo that's willing to ingest bacteria, I guess, that's going to advance the field in some way. We have to be able to find a balance between the two, right?
I think Mitchell brought up a great point, and maybe to expound on that further, that we do have pretty thorough regulating bodies, whether it's NIH grant reviewers who are made up of community members and scientists and things like that. But oftentimes these grant review committees will require proof of concept or proof of evidence, and that we have private companies or the NSF or other type of organizations to help bolster some of these maybe more novel or fringe type of studies. And I don't know, overall, I think that's okay. Right now where we're at, that we don't automatically fund multi-million-dollar studies for potential fringe type of things, and to have, I know it puts a lot of barriers for people who don't have access to all the supplies and lab resources and things like that. And there's a lot of inequity already baked into our system, but I don't know. I think we got some good checks and balances, at least in the U.S.
I think the thing that I was trying to harp on too, and somewhat of a soapbox that I'll get on, is that the way you communicate science to, for example, grants, it's persuasive writing. You have to convince someone that what you are doing is the right thing to do and is the best use of their money. That's the whole point. So it's persuading a group of people that what you are saying is so important. I think for, say, the crazies that are going to go ahead and ingest H. pylori, it's so important that if you have cool ideas like that, if you feel a little bit mad science-y, you gotta go and convince people that it actually is important to study. And this is where the way we communicate and convince people becomes really important, because science, by necessity, must be shared with people, and it must convince people of a certain, I guess, conclusion. And without the ability to communicate that, without the ability to convince someone, hey, this is the way that or what I should do, your science isn't going to be heard. So it is on the governing bodies, but it's also on the scientists themselves to be good salesmen of their science.
So as an American, I recognize that I have a bit of a bias toward individualism. I know this exists in me, but also if that scientist is right and he still can't convince the governing body of science because of maybe political expediency, because of an administration or something like that, that it's worth studying, is he any less right?
No.
Is his information any less valuable?
This is if a tree falls in the woods and no one is there to hear it. Does it still make a sound?
Yeah, to give a real life example, the MAPS project and psychedelic studies, right? There are several, there's decades of barring research on the use of psychedelics for mental health purposes. But I think that's maybe like an example of that, in air quotes, like mad scientists, people studying things that were banned or illegal, but who like had dedication and who were, like Riley said, able to like effectively communicate to private investors or to private individuals in that individualistic like aspect to like sway and convince people that what they were studying was worth it. And like now we have like NIH funded studies using MDMA, psilocybin, ketamine, etc. And like I think you're right, like harkening back on what you said, like it took fringe people, but like with our checks and balances, like although it's slow and it's at like a glacial speed, what I feel like is at glacial speed, like it's not at glacial speed for like no reason.
I would like to bring it back to the vomit doctor.
You Googled this. This is a real thing, isn't it?
I did Google this is a real thing, and I believe we've talked about it on the show before. It was sort of sitting in my subconscious from the 450 so some odd episodes that are in there somewhere. Stubbins Firth, a doctor.
What a name. Can we just pause on Stubbins Firth?
That is incredible.
Yeah.
That is the greatest name of all time.
He observed that yellow fever was more common during the summer and disappeared during the winter, and he concluded it wasn't a contagious disease, but that it was caused by stimulation, heat, food, noise, things like that. I'm not really sure how he came up with that theory, but
I've heard worse explanations.
And he went to prove it. He set out to demonstrate that no matter what he did, he wouldn't get sick from yellow fever. So he, made small incisions on his arms, poured fresh black vomit obtained from a yellow fever patient into the cuts. He also dribbled vomit into his eyes. He fried some in a skillet and inhaled the fumes.
Oh, yeah.
He's doing too much.
He fashioned some into a pill and swallowed it. This is from the Museum of Hoaxes. Hoaxes.org, a review of 20 most bizarre experiments of all time, if you want to look into that. He smeared himself with other yellow fever tainted fluids like blood, saliva, perspiration, urine. Healthy as ever, he declared his theory proved, and he apparently was fine.
Well,
his last name was Fetish. Sorry,
Stubbins
for Fetish. Oh,
Stubbins.
Great.
I could see how you might.
Okay, sorry, I misheard you.
Well, of course, yellow fever is spread by a mosquito bite.
Yeah.
And so he would, that's the thing though. He didn't know what he didn't know.
Right.
So,
but it's interesting that he was like this individual person, like screaming into the void, like, this is what I think. And, he's one of the nutcases that we talk about versus, Jonas Salk, I think, who polio vaccine, who, was also kind of this archetypal, I think, lone experimenter.
A little bit, yeah.
If we're
injecting people.
I have a pop culture reference. The Last of Us.
Right. It turns out Salk was right and Firth was wrong. I guess we need both of those kind of people, and now it's just fun to look back at Stubbins and go,
well, this happens in The Last of Us. If anyone watches,
spoilers. No,
this is not.
This game came out like 10 years ago.
Okay, well, the HBO series is
an unmentioned character tries to do something crazy and tries to use her blood to cure someone, and it doesn't really work. So spoiler.
I just said no spoilers.
Well, it's not that big of a spoiler.
Bleep it out for the kids at home. Skip this part.
I will say, getting back to the person screaming into the void, it does go both ways, and I think there's advantages for having all this regulation and structure. There's also disadvantages, because if someone who's on one of these committees that looks at your grants or decides if your paper gets to get published in a big name journal, if they don't like you or they feel threatened by your science for whatever reason, they can have a lot of power potentially to quash what your science is.
Sure.
That happens pretty much to everyone at some point in their scientific career, whether it's medical science or basic science. There was the Nobel Prize in 2011 in medicine was for the discovery of dendritic cells. And Ralph Steinman was an immunologist, and I think it was in the 70s he discovered dendritic cells. And this is a kind of cell that conditions T cells to go out and be functional. So they're tremendously important for the immune system. Vaccines wouldn't work if dendritic cells didn't exist. At the time, macrophages, which are another kind of cell that's very similar to a dendritic cell, that was kind of the dogma, was that macrophages exist, and they are the ones that condition adaptive immune responses, like after you get sick or after a vaccine. And Ralph Simon spent years and years kind of screaming to the void. He would go to conferences. He would say, look at my data. These are dendritic cells. They're not macrophages. They're different. I'm not saying macrophages aren't important, but I'm saying that dendritic cells are new and that we need to study them. And people would like heckle him at these research conferences. No one believed him. A lot of his early publications were not in like great journals, but he persisted and eventually he won the Nobel Prize for it. And so it really does go both ways. I mean, some things that are actually good end up getting quashed or held back for a long time because it doesn't sit well with whoever the establishment is in those, study sections or leadership positions.
One of the greatest tragedies of modern science, story makes me a little emotional. He actually didn't know that he won the Nobel Prize.
Yes.
Because he died before they reached out to him. One of the very few people to receive it posthumously because it was awarded before they knew that he had passed away. But I mean, medicine is so much better for this man who refused to stop screaming into the void. He just kept going, right? So I
don't know how we get around it, because I feel like that's like applicable to not even like, I guess maybe it's like discovery in general, but like the internet, email, everybody's like, oh, this will never work. Like,
it's human nature.
It's human. Yeah, correct.
What's interesting is I feel like a lot with kind of the way that the internet has evolved over the last 20 years, you could argue that a lot more voices are being heard in 2023 than they were in 1990 because of the advent of social media, etc. I don't necessarily think I could say the same for science because of all the hierarchy that still exists, with journals being seen as better than other journals, with grant types being seen as better than other grant types. Like, I think that you could have really awesome science and have it published in kind of a third tier journal and tweet about it, and people like would still have some degree of bias because of the journal that it was published in. So whereas we've got this democracy of sorts of ideas in which everyone kind of has their fair share of say based on social media, I think science still lacks in that because of all these established blockades and or hierarchy that keeps really awesome science from getting heard. Granted, those same systems probably prevent not so great science from being heard by a really wide mass. And that's where it becomes hard, is how do you piece apart those things?
The thing is that a lot of bad science, and this isn't like poorly executed studies do get published because they're politically expedient. I'm not talking about political parties here. I'm just like the politics of the journals or of academia, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so some guy that has, I don't know, several hundred publications to his name, turns out he's just cranking out these papers that really aren't doing anything to the field at all. They're just something else that has his name on it, right? And it's kind of a waste of everybody's energy, but he keeps getting published because he's publishing it in a field that is expedient and he represents a big name, and it just keeps happening, right? And so that's also a problem. And again, I agree with you. The system is imperfect. It still does a lot of good in the world. I'm very fond of our American system of putting out more knowledge into the world. I have concerns.
It's when you look at like these scientific journals, their goal is to raise their stature in the field. And so what they do when they look at papers, mostly what they care about is how much is this going to get cited? Is there going to be some big news press about the fact that this paper was published and the science was done? It's not necessarily, is it the best done science, or is it something that's really meaningful or what have you? Those things correlate. So there are, I would say on average, the papers that are in the higher tier journals tend to be better. They tend to be more impactful, but it's not a perfect system. I would say it's a good system that has some serious flaws, is kind of how I would describe it. But then I'm, looking at it from the framework of what I know.
Yeah. And one of the reasons that I'm kind of biased at this point is I've done a lot of research over the last several years in cancer policy, and that, like, a lot of my undergrad work was with cancer researching and that kind of thing. And we would analyze drugs that had been studied and then put on the market. And the general argument from the capitalist perspective is every new drug is a good thing because it collectively drives prices down, right? But then you start looking at these drugs that aren't better and are probably a little bit worse or way worse than the drugs that already exist. But because they can control what they decide their control arm is, they fudge the data just enough that it looks like it's saying something, right? And then it's only the poor people get hurt, right? So
it's a racket.
And it's very frustrating to see that throughout scientific communities, but especially in medicine, in a country where at the end of the day, the patient's the one that's going to go bankrupt, right? So this is a heavy conversation for the day.
I enjoyed it.
Should we end with some 5-hour energy enemas to get us perked up?
Shortcoats, if you're enjoying our conversation today, I'd be grateful if you'd let people know by posting a story on Instagram or Facebook or tweeting about us. And don't forget to tag us in your post.
Thank you.
This is maybe a hot take, and I haven't like caught the money out, but talking about refinancing or, what are they called? Loans when you move. Why did my brain just blank? You just said it. No, not refinancing loans, but relocation loans.
Relocation loans?
Relocation loans. Maybe this is like a personal take. I don't know. I didn't like return a lot of my loans that were recommended me. And like now at the end of M4, looking at like moving across the country, which is like really expensive, I'm like kind of glad I didn't. So something to think about, I guess, if you're a medical student or soon to be medical student, who's financing their education on their own or with loans. With government loans or federal loans, you have the ability within the first 100 days of the disbursement to like return those loans. So those loans like won't accrue interest if you return them. However, there's like the origination fee, so you'll be charged for taking that money out. As medical students, like a common piece of financial advice is to return unused loans so that they won't like accrue interest. Granted, like we were in a fortunate position with the pandemic and the CARES Act or HEROES Act, in that like our loans weren't accruing interest. So like knowing that, or looking forward in my final year, knowing that I would hopefully be moving across the country and that it's expensive and you need several thousands of dollars for a new expensive apartment, moving across the country, etc. That like there are relocation loans that you can take out that are private from well-meaning institutions. However, if you like don't return those loans in your final year, all of your like indebtedness will stay within the federal government, which I think has like a lot of benefits before you start like expanding your like financial portfolio into like private companies or credit cards or things like that. So this is just something I don't know. I haven't like tallied if it's going to cost me money or save me money at the end of the day by not returning the loans that I took out and didn't use. Well, it probably comes down to
interest rate, right?
But it's and it's something to think about too, right? Like the federal loans are at like whatever right now, it's like 6.7, might go up, might go down with the Feds. But there's so many like benefits that come from federal loans, and that like you don't need a guarantor. Like if you die, your family members aren't going to be like on the hook for your debt. Whereas with some of these like private loans, or if you refinance or take out private loans, like you may need to like put other people on the hook as a guarantor, and like I don't have anybody in my family who would be like ready or willing to do that, or is like in a position to do that. So this
Dave
is just,
said he would for you.
Really? Oh, should we do some celebratory enemas together? Like clink, pink.
That was the sound of our anuses.
Yeah. Pinkies up.
Why did I say that?
Yeah. The clink was supposed to be the 5-hour energy shots, not our anuses, but
chaotic.
Anyway,
I can't leave that in.
Yeah, it's up to you.
You could look at the numbers and decide, well, that particular idea isn't for me. I mean, the thing that I think about when people are like, well, I decided not to do that because I knew that I would be able to pay it off or whatever. Right. But, life is uncertain. You could get sick and not be able to finish med school. Correct. You could not match and never match. Like,
yep.
So it all depends on your aversion to risk.
Correct.
I'm maybe more risk averse than you are.
Oh no, I was very like a bird in the hand is worth more than two in the bush. Like, sorry, not to be in bush, but like if I, if I have,
don't put disrespect.
If I have
bird in the hand is worth more than two in the bee and bush.
Yeah, correct. Shout out Riley and Thomas. That like as I have this money now, all from like one place where like the rest of my like federal loans have come from. Like I feel more like certain, secure. I know that like the benefits of like these loans being discharged if I were to die or face like a grave disability. And I just, thought this would be like an appropriate time to like plug to other students to like think about where your money is coming from and like what potential like harms may become of you if you like diversify too much. So maybe this is my like be a little less risky. Maybe.
Okay.
If it works for you and if it makes
coming from having made a risky choice.
Yeah, correct.
That has turned out to be maybe a little less risky.
Correct.
New York, notoriously cheap to live.
100%. I will be eating ramen, but it will be good ramen.
It will be great ramen.
Would it be all right if I just like a final plug, because I hate to end on a sour note. Research is awesome and science is going to inevitably get better, and we're going to refine the process, and we're going to get better at getting science out to people. It's going to happen. Okay. The world only gets better.
Yeah, I think we talked a lot about like drawbacks and downsides of many different things, but it's incredible what we can do with medicine these days. In every field of medicine, there's been so many advancements that have improved quality of life, have extended people's lives. And it's really just like tremendous when you talk with older physicians about what they used to do, the options that they had for patients. Many times they were much more limited than they are today. And we can really do incredible things. And that's because there have been so many people out there who have just like busted their asses for so long. And every single person's contribution is usually fairly small and incremental on its own. And I think that's why it's hard to communicate why it's important. But when you add that all together, you have modern medicine, which is something that is very special, I think.
Stubbins did some good work.
Yes.
He proved,
even with the bureaucracy of everything.
A negative hypothesis is still like a hypothesis, right? Like, and it's
that's right. And even though he thought something that was wrong, we still managed to get to the right
now
answer.
We don't have to do that because of him,
Thank
right?
you, Stubbins.
Thank you for your sacrifice, Stubbins. So people are busting.
We can go by Stubbs.
People are busting their asses
Doc
so
Stubbs.
we can open up our asses for those enemas.
Oh my God.
Yes.
Just the through line, the callbacks.
Nathan has matched. He does not give a shit.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Our shits may have some 5-hour energy.
I don't think you're going to have to do many enemas in psych, are you? Probably not.
Well, we have to do 3 months of internal medicine.
Oh, there you go.
And a month of EM.
So maybe.
It's, a little less. I feel like nowadays it's more like manual disimpaction or deimpaction than enemas, but that's okay.
I digress.
Well, Shakespeare said, more or less, that all the world's a stage. All the world.
Al Stubbins.
Get that old
It's a
English
stage.
accent,
All the world's a stage, and all the people merely players. So let's play an improv game. What do you say?
We got time.
I'm going to give you a starting line as well as 5 phrases. We'll have one phrase each. Our job is to construct a story together. So we'll have turns, and during your turn, you'll contribute to the story, and you'll incorporate the phrase that is assigned to you, however you like. We'll do it 45 seconds. We'll see what happens.
Okay.
The 45 seconds begins as soon as you start talking. You must talk throughout the 45 seconds, and when time's up, you stop, even mid-sentence, for the next person to take over.
Is the goal to trip up the next person or to set them up?
I just want a fun story.
Okay.
And
We're just,
improv is
going.
always
good.
Circle. Yep.
And improv is always
yes,
I guess you could be trying to trip them up in a funny way.
Don't be
There's like
curmudgeonly.
competitive
Right.
improv sports.
Let's see what this happens.
We have enough competition in our lives already.
Riley, you're
do this
going
one as a
down.
team.
Yeah, you're going down.
I'm going to improv this shit. I'm just kidding. Sorry.
So I'm 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How about that?
Okay.
Are we just going to keep going, or are we ending?
We're going to end on 5.
All right.
And on me. Perfect.
So we'll start. Today I went to my doctor's appointment, and she told me that I have an unexpected talent, which is that I can hold things with my nostrils, not with my anus, but with my
We all
nostrils.
thought it was going there.
Yeah, no, not going there. Not going to even say those words. And we discovered this while I was sort of in the exam room, and she, had her, the light that they shine into your eyes. What do they call that light?
Pen light.
The pen light. They shine into my eyes, and I just sort of reached out with my nostril and grabbed it. I wasn't even thinking about it. I was like, that's in my face. I'm going to grab it.
And then, now that I discovered this unexpected talent that I now have, I decided to take the show on the road. I discovered that with a little bit of practice, not only can I grab things with my nostrils, I can actually peel a banana and then toss the banana peel to the side. This is a showstopper, let me tell you. And then feed myself the banana. And I've taken this around. I'm not getting a lot of applause, but this is my new stand-up act. So where are we on the time?
So then I decided, since I'm such a good Samaritan and humanitarian and just a great person in general, that I would take this talent and really improve the world with it. So I went around and I started thinking, how can I make people happier? Well, first of all, I would go to places where people are sad, wherever that might be, and I would just start peeling bananas in front of them with my nose. And people sometimes laugh and sometimes they hit me, but really I focus on the positives. And I do laughter therapy now. I go around uninvited, usually. Actually, no one ever invites me, and I peel bananas. It's like a one-man circus. basically.
Since I've seen the benefits of this laughter therapy with about 20% of the people that I do it in front of, I decided that I should study this. You know, we talk about researchers getting crazy ideas, putting vomit in their cuts, and I thought, wow, I should study this. So I founded a secret laboratory because no one would fund this work, and I got about one more person that could peel a banana with their nose. It was my mom. It's genetic, actually, so that was exciting to find out. And so my mom and I invite guests into our secret laboratory, and we're at this point just trying to see how many people we can make laugh. We're getting all of the numbers. We're seeing how high they laugh, how long they laugh, like how low,
Nathan?
like how.
And while we're finding out if they can laugh or not, somebody along the way, along our circus, that we forgot to mention was the mischievous hamster that crawled up in my other nostril, my left nostril in specific. He was hiding there as my nose can peel bananas and make people laugh. One day I started to hear a voice in my head from this mischievous hamster telling me that, hey, if your nose can do all of these things, maybe you should try inserting enemas. There's one way that you can make people laugh, and that's through peeling bananas. But have you tried inserting an enema and pouring in a 5-hour energy? And then our laughter rates and this laughter therapy in our secret laboratory with our unexpected talent went through the roof. I'm telling you, 100% laughter rates with these 5-hour energy enemas and these nose banana peeling nostrils.
There you go. That's what I was after.
He brought it back.
Yeah.
And the hamster, that's like, you guys know that Eminem song?
No.
I can't say it.
No, say it. No, say what?
It's an Eminem song where he talks about like a gerbil crawling up his
Oh.
It's like, yeah.
That's a South Park
It's old
episode.
school.
Back in the day, a certain famous actor was rumored that
If you say allegedly, they can't come for you.
enjoy that sort of thing.
It's is it a gerbil?
A gerbil.
It's
yes.
a gerbil.
A
There
gerbil.
are subsets of people that allegedly would appreciate that.
Would
find it.
I'm going to assume none of us in this room have
Oh,
it.
you guys heard about the eel thing? Are you talking about that?
No, what's
No,
the eel
yes,
thing?
Thailand, yes,
eel?
yeah. I was.
I'm not
you
gonna
for-
yuck someone's yum,
Yeah.
but it's
Then the
yuck
eel
for
will,
me.
like, bite
I'm
through
not
your
kink
colon
shaming.
wall.
I might
Yeah.
kink ask why.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's actual.
I'm just kink questioning.
Okay,
So this episode is also brought to you by your rectum. A wonderful biological marvel. It serves you well. Be careful with what you put in it.
Yeah.
just like your nose, it can hold a lot of things.
And be careful what comes out of it.
Yeah.
Also,
Just be aware.
Just be aware.
We'll do the next one. We'll start with you, Mitch. The starting phrase is, "Sir, you should have seen that coming when the tongue depressor."
Yeah, you should have seen it coming when the tongue depressor, you like slipped it through my throat, and then there was just the right angle and the right force, and it went all the way down through my GI tract, and now it is sticking out of my butthole, and it is stuck there. I think there's a splinter also because it's not coming out no matter how hard we're trying to pull, and there's a little bit of blood. And I just think, like, as a doctor, I mean, as an M1, you should have learned how to use a tongue depressor, so I might sue you for malpractice. Yeah, because also I don't like you that much anyway. And that's one of the reasons that we sue people. So, yeah, please get this out.
Jeff.
Oh, I'm a sorry patient. Like, we should, you know, things happen. We should probably chalk this up to a comedic mishap, you know? If you don't mind, I'm actually going to go grab the rest of the medical team because I'm sure they're going to want to help us with this procedure, getting this out, and for no other reason. So, excuse me for just 1 second.
Or at least see the popsicle stick or the tongue depressor sticking out. I mean, that's a pretty important medical finding right there, and I think it's unusual. And one thing that I know about my colleagues in medicine is that they really love an unusual finding, and I haven't seen this before. So let's bring in the whole team, and we'll look at the anal tongue depressor.
The anal popsicle.
Okay. Although this may be a comedic mishap, and I'm sure that popsicle has an unusual taste, there is one medical school story that I've had that I think could work. And it involves enemas, but hear me out.
It always does with
hear
you,
me
Dr.
out. Hear me out. When people have a prolapsed anus, you can use sugar and glucose to help draw water out to reduce the anus. And so I'm thinking that we one time back in medical school, we used a sugar enema, a 5-hour energy, to reduce this prolapsed anus. And I'm wondering if we could use this 5-hour energy to get rid of that tongue depressor out of your anus.
Riley.
It was at this point that the medical student spoke, and the entire office just started laughing right in the medical student's face, just harassing that medical student for suggesting the 5-hour enema. Flash forward 20 years, that medical student is actually earning the Nobel Prize for the 5-hour energy enema that they have then found out causes popsicle sticks and or tongue depressors to spontaneously be removed from the anus. This medical student has gone on to earn millions and lots of praise and etc. And so at the end of the day, who's really laughing? It's not the office. It's science who missed this genius at the very beginning.
Science is laughing.
Very good.
Full circle.
Thank you.
Nice. Good job. That's our show. Jeff, Riley, Mitch, Nathan, thank you for being on the show with me today.
Dave.
It was a plenum of fun.
And thanks for producing the show today, Jeff. Appreciate that.
Thanks, Jeff.
I'm always happy to share my opinions.
And what kind of enema would I be if I didn't thank you, Shortcoats, for making us a part of your week? If you're new and you like what you heard today, follow the show wherever fine podcasts are available. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, YouTube. We're there. The show is made possible by a generous donation by Carver College of Medicine student government and ongoing support from the Writing and Humanities program. Our music is by Dr. Vox and Catmosphere. I'm Dave Etler saying don't let the bastards get you down. Talk to you in 1 week.
I do love screaming into the void with you guys.
Hi, Shortcoats. Look, life in medical education, life in America, life in the world is often difficult. And I often wish I could help. All I have is this podcast, but in my wildest dreams, you have the support you need to lead a life of your choosing. You deserve to be happy, healthy, and successful in whatever ways you define those words. So if you need support because you've experienced racism, discrimination, harassment, mental health crises, I want you to be able to get the help that you need. And so I'm going to put some links in the show notes to some resources that you can use. But the bottom line is that for what it's worth, I see you. I know you're out there. I wish I could do more. Maybe I can in ways that I don't understand yet or know about. But I see you, and I'm glad you're here, and other people are too. This Shortcode podcast is a proud member of the MedEd Media Network. Inspiration, information, and guidance on your journey to medical school and beyond at mededmedia.com.